From the dawn of the Trump era, the political landscape of North America began to shift radically, as if an unexpected storm had darkened the skies over the traditionally strong friendship between the United States and Canada. In those early days, uncertainty filled the air. Old alliances forged over decades seemed to tremble in the face of an impending new order. It was on a cold morning early in his presidency that, amidst sensational headlines and heated debates, the words that would mark the beginning of a dramatic deterioration in the bilateral relationship were first heard. President Trump, with his characteristic defiant tone and unfiltered rhetoric, publicly floated the controversial and to many absurd idea of annexing Canada. At first, this statement was met with disbelief and even nervous laughter in Ottawa, where Canadian leaders dismissed it as a bad joke. However, what started as an ironic remark quickly turned into a tangible threat. With each new public appearance, Trump went beyond mere jokes, using his influence to paint a grim picture. Without the massive subsidies that, according to him, made Canada an overly expensive ally, the northern neighbor would become unsustainable, a nation on the brink of collapse. This rhetoric not only fueled heated discussions in the media, but also triggered a wave of anxiety within the international community. Canadians who had long enjoyed a stable and close relationship with their southern neighbors began questioning the future of their sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Washington, the strategy seemed clear, using economic force as a diplomatic weapon. The idea was simple but devastating in its scope: turn Canada into a dependent state, incapable of resisting the tax and economic pressures that threatened to destabilize its economy. With every speech, it became increasingly evident that what initially appeared to be a lighthearted provocation was, in reality, the prelude to a serious and structural confrontation. Trump's rhetoric, filled with warnings and promises of drastic economic measures, began echoing across every major media outlet. News segments and headlines were flooded with phrases like, "Without subsidies, Canada cannot survive, and America's economic might will shake our northern neighbors." In the halls of power in Ottawa, a mix of indignation and concern took hold. How does one respond to a threat that blurs the line between sarcastic humor and economic coercion? The atmosphere grew tense, and every political decision became a delicate balancing act. Canadians, long accustomed to a foreign policy based on mutual respect and cooperation, suddenly found themselves forced to rethink their position. The idea of annexation, initially dismissed and treated lightly, transformed into a disturbing reminder that even the strongest relationships can fracture under external pressure. Every statement and act of disdain seemed to plunge the nation into a state of constant vigilance, where security and prosperity were now at risk due to unilateral and reckless decisions. In this context, Trump's warning about the use of economic force was not just a play on words, but an unequivocal signal of a paradigm shift. Without subsidies, according to his argument, Canada would be forced to face an unforgiving economic reality in which its very viability was at stake. The country's fragile stability had become the epicenter of a conflict that threatened to forever reshape the region's geopolitics. Thus, in this opening chapter, the deterioration of the United States-Canada relationship sets the stage for an era of deep tensions, where old friendships are overshadowed by new threats, and where national sovereignty and pride are put to the test under mounting economic pressure. A story that, even in its earliest moments, already foreshadowed a struggle for identity and autonomy in an increasingly unpredictable world. The tension between the United States and Canada had been simmering for months, but in early 2025, it finally boiled over into a full-scale economic conflict. What had once been a stable and cooperative relationship was now teetering on the edge of collapse.
Sir, no, sir!
It all began in February when the Trump administration made a bold and aggressive move, imposing a 25% tariff on most Canadian imports with a reduced 10% tariff on energy products. The justification? Trump claimed it was necessary to combat what he called an invasion of illegal drugs and migrants crossing the northern border. But the reality was different. The move sent shockwaves through the Canadian economy, hitting critical industries like steel, manufacturing, and agriculture. Businesses, already struggling with supply chain disruptions and inflationary pressures, were now faced with an even greater challenge. For a brief moment, there was hope that diplomacy could prevent a crisis. Canadian officials worked tirelessly behind the scenes, engaging in emergency negotiations to try and delay the implementation of the tariffs. And for a month, they succeeded. There was a temporary suspension, a flicker of optimism that perhaps cooler heads would prevail. But in March, that hope vanished. The tariffs took effect, and the impact was immediate. Markets reacted with panic. Canadian businesses scrambled to find new trading partners, while investors feared the long-term consequences. Meanwhile, citizens braced for rising prices as the cost of imported goods from the U.S. surged. Grocery bills, construction materials, and consumer products all became more expensive overnight. The economic ties that had long defined the U.S. Canada relationship were unraveling at an alarming rate. Yet just as Canada was beginning to process the consequences, Trump struck again. Not content with the existing tariffs, he issued a new threat, doubling tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to a devastating 50%. The move was a direct response to Ontario's decision to impose its own retaliatory measure, a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to key U.S. states. Trump, never one to back down from a confrontation, made it clear that economic warfare would be his primary strategy. The message was unmistakable. Canada was no longer being treated as an ally but as a competitor to be dominated. The traditional friendship between the two nations had crumbled under the weight of economic hostility. For Canada, the implications were profound. The country could no longer rely on the United States as its primary trading partner, and the search for alternative economic alliances became an urgent national priority. This was more than just a trade dispute. It was a defining moment in Canada's history, one that would push the nation to forge new relationships, rethink its economic strategy, and prepare for an uncertain future in a rapidly shifting global order. With mounting economic pressure and a trade war escalating by the day, Canada could no longer afford to wait. The newly sworn-in Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped onto the political stage with a clear and resolute message. Canada would not be bullied into submission. In his first national address, he vowed to protect Canadian workers and businesses from what he called. His words were not just rhetoric, they signaled a strategic shift in Canada's foreign and economic policies. In a bold move that broke decades of diplomatic tradition, Carney chose to make his first official international visit not to Washington, but to Europe. His itinerary took him to Paris and London, where he met with French President Emmanuel Macron and British officials. The meetings were more than symbolic. They marked the beginning of a new era in Canadian diplomacy. As the United States turned inward, Canada was looking outward, seeking alliances with reliable partners who valued fair trade and economic cooperation. Standing alongside Macron at the Élysée Palace, Carney reinforced Canada's commitment to strengthening economic and defense ties with Europe. He emphasized the importance of, stating that global commerce should not be dictated by unilateral tariffs and economic threats. The message was clear. Canada was ready to move beyond its historic reliance on the U.S. and forge new partnerships that would ensure its economic security and sovereignty. From London, Carney continued to push forward with his vision. At 10 Downing Street, he met with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to discuss deeper economic and security cooperation, including joint ventures in clean energy, artificial intelligence, and critical minerals. The two leaders announced a new intelligence sharing agreement, a move that signaled not only a growing economic partnership, but also a strategic defense alignment. As tensions with the U.S. continued to rise, it became evident that Canada was preparing for a future where its primary alliances lay across the Atlantic, rather than just across its southern border. Meanwhile, back in Canada, public sentiment was shifting. With Trump's threats of economic coercion still looming, many Canadians began to see Europe not just as an alternative trading partner, but as a potential long-term economic and political ally. Polls showed a growing interest in strengthening ties with the European Union, and for the first time, serious discussions about Canada deepening its integration with the EU began to emerge. What had started as a defensive maneuver against U.S. tariffs was quickly evolving into a historic realignment, one that could redefine Canada's place in the global order for generations to come. As tensions between Canada and the United States continued to mount, the northern nation found itself at a crossroads. The economic and political landscape that had once been defined by a deep partnership with its southern neighbor was shifting rapidly. The trade war, once seen as a temporary crisis, had evolved into a fundamental realignment of Canada's global strategy. In response, the Canadian government doubled down on its efforts to strengthen international ties, most notably with the European Union. In a decisive move, Canada and the EU accelerated negotiations on a comprehensive free trade agreement that would progressively eliminate nearly all tariffs between the two economies. This agreement, a cornerstone of Canada's new economic policy, was not just about trade, it was about security, stability, and a shared vision for the future. By diversifying its trade relationships, Canada was ensuring that its economy would no longer be held hostage by the unpredictable policies of a single nation. The shift was not just political, but deeply cultural. Public opinion in Canada was undergoing a transformation. For decades, the United States had been seen as Canada's closest and most reliable ally, but now, that perception was changing. Polls indicated a significant increase in support for closer ties with Europe, with many Canadians seeing the EU as a more stable and cooperative partner. The idea of strengthening the transatlantic relationship was no longer just an economic necessity, it was becoming a reflection of Canada's evolving identity on the world stage. This realignment extended beyond trade. Defense and security cooperation with Europe were also intensifying. Canadian officials met with NATO partners to discuss deeper military collaboration, including intelligence sharing and joint defense initiatives. As Trump's administration continued to push an isolationist agenda, Canada positioned itself as a nation committed to multilateralism, working alongside allies who valued collective security and diplomatic engagement. At home, businesses and industries adapted to this new reality. With reduced reliance on the U.S. market, Canadian companies began expanding their reach into Europe, taking advantage of the newly established trade pathways. Sectors such as technology, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence found new opportunities in European markets, fostering innovation and investment that would shape Canada's economy for years to come. Yet despite these strategic moves, one question remained. Was this the definitive end of the U.S. Canada Alliance as it had been known for generations? While economic and political ties with Washington remained, they were undeniably weaker. The era of unquestioned loyalty to the United States was over. In its place, a new Canada was emerging, one that was globally oriented, economically diversified, and fiercely protective of its sovereignty. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Canada was no longer just reacting to Trump's aggressive policies. It was actively shaping its own destiny. The country had embraced a future where its prosperity and security were no longer tied to a single partnership but built upon a diverse network of allies across the world. This was more than just a response to a trade war, it was the birth of a new era for Canada on the global stage.